The morning sun had barely risen, painting the clouds in shades of copper and gold. A soft mist clung to the ground, swirling gently around the parking lot of a roadside diner on the edge of a quiet town. The air smelled of bacon grease and black coffee. Inside, the low murmur of conversation mixed with the faint hum of a jukebox that had seen better days. Outside, a line of Harley-Davidsons gleamed beneath the pale light. Their chrome caught every ray of sun, every breath of smoke that drifted from the mouths of the men who owned them. They were bikers, broad-shouldered, tattooed, leather-clad, the kind of men most people avoided without a second thought. They belonged to the Hells Angels, a name that carried both fear and fascination. But that morning they were not outlaws. They were simply travelers sharing breakfast and laughter, their heavy boots tapping lightly against the diner floor as stories rolled between them, stories of the road, of scars and fights, of the brotherhood that tied them together stronger than blood. Mason Cole sat near the window, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. His hair was streaked with gray, his jaw rough with stubble. He was not smiling, but there was calm in his eyes, a kind of watchful stillness. The laughter of his brothers echoed around him, bouncing off the walls like wind against metal. Mason listened, but his mind drifted. He had lived too many lives for a man his age, soldier, mechanic, brother, sinner, and now he simply rode. Then came the sound. At first, it was faint, a cry, distant and broken, carried by the cold wind from across the road. It didn't belong to the morning. It didn't belong to laughter. It was the kind of sound that could freeze the heart mid-beat. Heads turned. The laughter faded. Through the glass, Mason saw movement, a small figure stumbling across the lot, framed by the rising light. She was no older than 7, maybe 8, wearing a red dress smeared with dirt and tears. Her boots looked 2 sizes too big, her hair tangled, her breath coming in sharp, frightened gasps. When she reached the edge of the lot, she tripped, caught herself and screamed again, "Please! They're hurting my mama." Her voice tore through the air like a blade. For a moment the world fell utterly still. Even the engines seemed to hold their breath. A few truckers looked up from their gas pumps but did nothing. People glanced, hesitated, then looked away, the universal reflex of fear disguised as indifference. But Mason rose. He moved before his mind could form a thought. His boots struck the pavement with purpose as he crossed the distance between them. The girl stopped, trembling, her small hands shaking as she pointed back toward the road. "Where is she?" Mason's voice was low but steady, rough from years of smoke and shouting. The girl tried to speak, but the words broke between sobs. She lifted her arm again, pointing down the 2-lane road that cut through the trees. "In the trailers," she managed. "They're beating her. Please, please help her." For one heartbeat, Mason stared in that direction, toward the line of old trailers barely visible through the morning fog. He didn't hesitate after that. "Tank Rider," he said sharply to 2 of his brothers. "With me." 3 engines roared to life. The sudden thunder of motorcycles shattered the quiet like a storm breaking over calm water. Mason swung his leg over the Harley, gunning the throttle. Dust and gravel spun beneath the tires as they sped off down the road. Inside the diner, the others stood frozen. A biker named Reaper knelt beside the little girl, wrapping his jacket around her small shoulders. The leather swallowed her completely, but she clung to it like armor. "Come on, sweetheart," he said softly. "You're safe now. Sit tight." He led her to a booth by the window, poured her some water, and watched as she pressed her palms together, whispering something only she could hear. Outside, the red taillights faded into the horizon. Minutes crawled by. The sound of the engines was gone now, replaced by the distant hum of the highway. Inside, the diner had turned into a vacuum, every person watching that same window waiting for a sign. Mason's coffee cup sat untouched on the counter, steam now rising faintly from it like a ghost. 5 minutes passed. Then 6. And then the first sound came, faint but unmistakable. Engines again mixed with something else, shouting. Chaos carried on the wind. The girl froze, her eyes darting to the window. Reaper's hand tightened around the edge of the table. Somewhere beyond those trees, something was unfolding, something violent, something that would change more than one life that morning. Because sometimes fate does not whisper. Sometimes it screams through the trembling voice of a child in red, begging the world to care. And that morning, 3 men with leather vests and scarred hands answered that scream. They didn't know yet that what waited beyond that road was not just a rescue, it was redemption waiting to be earned. The engines roared through the cold air like thunder rolling down a narrow valley. Gravel spat out from under the Harley tires as Mason and his brothers tore down the 2-lane road. The town fell away behind them, replaced by open fields, frostbitten grass, and the distant outline of a half-collapsed trailer park surrounded by leafless trees. Mason's knuckles were white around the handlebars. Wind whipped against his face, stinging his eyes, but his focus never wavered. The little girl's voice still echoed in his head, "They're hurting my mama." It wasn't just a plea. It was the sound of innocence breaking. "Cut the noise," Mason barked over the engine. Tank and Ryder slowed slightly behind him. The engines quieted to a low rumble as they approached the first row of trailers. The air smelled of alcohol, rust, and damp earth. One window curtain flicked back as someone peered out, then disappeared. A shout erupted from somewhere ahead, deep, slurred, angry. Mason didn't hesitate. He killed the engine, kicked down the stand, and moved fast. The others followed, boots crunching on gravel. From one of the trailers came the unmistakable sound of violence, a crash, a scream, a man's voice dripping with rage. Mason reached the door in 3 strides. It was cracked open, the cheap wood trembling with each shout. He pushed it wide. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of liquor and fear. A man in a filthy shirt towered over a woman pinned against the wall. Her lip was split, her cheek was swollen purple. A broken bottle glinted near her feet. The man raised his hand again, but he never finished the motion. Mason was already moving. He grabbed the man's wrist mid-swing and twisted hard. Bone popped. The bottle slipped from his grasp and shattered on the linoleum. The man howled, spinning to strike back, but Tank slammed into him like a wall of muscle. The impact sent both crashing into a table that splintered beneath their weight. Ryder stepped forward, pinning the man's shoulder with one knee, his voice low and steady. "Stay down." Mason stood over him, his chest heaving. "You lay another hand on her, and you'll wish the cops get here before I do." His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of weight that came from living too close to hell for too long. The woman slid to the floor, trembling. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her arms shielding her face as if the beating might continue. Mason crouched beside her, his rough hands suddenly gentle. "It's over," he said quietly. "You're safe now." She looked up at him, confused by the sight, the skull patch on his vest, the tattoos on his arms, the tears burning behind his eyes. She managed to whisper, "He would have killed me." "Not today," Mason said. He reached for the small blanket lying on the couch and draped it around her shoulders. Outside, sirens began to wail in the distance, faint but growing closer. Someone must have called them. Mason stood, glancing at his brothers. "We're done here." Tank wiped his bloody knuckles on his jeans and muttered, "That guy won't lift his hand for a while." They left the trailer just as the first police cruiser screeched to a stop in the dirt road. Dust clouded around the flashing lights. Officers jumped out, hands near their holsters, their eyes widening as they took in the scene. 3 bikers standing calm beside a beaten man groaning in the dirt. One officer shouted, "Hands where we can see them." Mason raised his arms slowly. "Easy," he said. "We're the ones who stopped it." The woman stumbled out of the trailer, clutching the blanket. "They saved me," she cried. "They saved me and my little girl." The officers hesitated. One of them, older, mustached, lowered his weapon slightly and nodded. "Get her checked out," he said to his partner. Mason exhaled, relief washing through him in waves. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving only exhaustion and the faint ache of old scars. Moments later, a small voice pierced the noise, "Mama." The little girl came running down the road, Reaper right behind her. The child collided into her mother's arms, sobbing into her chest. The woman, Carla, cradled her as if she would never let go again. Mason turned away, his throat tightening. Reaper clapped him on the shoulder. "You did good, brother." Mason didn't answer. His eyes were on the little girl, Hannah, who was now looking up at him through a blur of tears. She stepped forward, still holding her mother's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Mason knelt so their eyes met. "You're the brave one," he said. "You ran for help when it mattered." She hesitated, then threw her arms around his neck. The hug caught him off guard, rough leather meeting fragile warmth. He stayed there, one arm lightly resting around her shoulders, feeling a part of himself soften that he hadn't known was still alive. When the police finally led the abuser away in cuffs, Mason walked mother and daughter to his motorcycle. He lifted the girl onto the seat just for a moment, letting her hold his helmet, far too large for her head. She giggled weakly through her tears, and Mason smiled for the first time that morning. "You did real good, kid," he said. "You're safe now." The rising sun cut through the trees, scattering gold across the road. Sirens faded, engines rumbled, and life seemed to exhale again. The danger had passed, but something larger had shifted, something invisible. When they rode back toward the diner, the world looked different. The same field stretched on either side, but the light had changed, softer, somehow cleaner. Mason glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the mother and daughter following in the police car. Hannah was waving from the back seat, her hand pressed to the glass. He raised 2 fingers from the handlebar in quiet acknowledgement. The road ahead gleamed like liquid sunlight. Behind them lay chaos and pain. Ahead of them, something new, not redemption exactly, but proof that even broken men could still do right. As the diner came back into view, Mason felt the weight on his chest ease. Reaper and Tank rode behind him in silence, and for once the thunder of the engines didn't sound wild or defiant. It sounded like peace. They pulled into the lot as the crowd that had gathered turned toward them. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Coffee cups hung halfway to mouths. The noise of the engines faded, replaced by quiet disbelief. Then the door opened. Carla stepped out of the cruiser, bruised but standing tall, her daughter clinging to her side. Every head turned. Every breath seemed to stop. And in that stillness, something rare and sacred filled the air: respect. The diner had never been that quiet before. Not even during the early mornings when truckers passed through half asleep or when storms rolled in heavy and gray. This silence was different, dense, charged, almost holy. Everyone stood frozen as Mason stepped off his bike. His boots hit the ground with a heavy thud that echoed louder than the engines ever had. Carla followed behind him, holding Hannah's hand tightly. Her face was bruised, but her spine was straight now, as if the strength of the road itself had settled inside her. The child's red dress fluttered slightly in the wind, and for a moment she looked like a tiny spark of life against the backdrop of black leather and chrome. The other bikers stood lined up near the motorcycles, their rough faces unreadable. One of them, Reaper, reached for his jacket and wordlessly draped it over Carla's shoulders. It was far too large, but somehow it looked right. Another placed a cup of hot coffee into her shaking hands. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The truckers near the gas pumps watched quietly, heads bowed slightly as if witnessing something sacred. Even the police officers who lingered by their cars said nothing. They just nodded once before stepping back, giving the moment space. Inside the diner, the old waitress who'd worked there longer than anyone could remember moved to the doorway. Her eyes glistened as she whispered to no one in particular, "They actually did it." And somewhere in the crowd, someone began to clap. It started softly, like rain on a tin roof. Then another joined in. And another. Until the small roadside lot filled with the sound of applause, raw, hesitant, but sincere. Carla's lip trembled as she looked around, uncertain how to respond. Mason simply gave a small nod, almost embarrassed, and turned back toward his bike. He was never a man who craved attention. He didn't see himself as a hero. He just couldn't stand by while a cry like that went unanswered. As the morning wore on, the crowd began to thin, but the story didn't fade. Truckers carried it down the highway to the next town over. A mechanic told it to a customer. By lunchtime, the tale of the little girl who ran to the bikers had already started to spread like wildfire. At the diner, Hannah sat at a booth by the window, swinging her small legs back and forth, a plate of pancakes in front of her. The plate looked enormous compared to her tiny hands, but she ate slowly, smiling each time one of the bikers passed by. They'd taken off their vests and hung them by the door, patches and all, as if trying to look less intimidating. Carla sat beside her, nursing her coffee. Her hands still shook every now and then, but her eyes, though tired, held gratitude that words couldn't express. Mason sat across from them, elbows on the table, staring out the window at the sunlight glinting off the motorcycles. He didn't say much. He never did. But when Hannah glanced up at him shyly, he smiled, a small, fleeting thing that softened the edges of his weathered face. "You're her little guardian angel," he said quietly. Hannah tilted her head. "Me?" Mason nodded. "You ran for help when everyone else froze. That makes you brave." She thought about it for a second, then whispered, "I was scared." He leaned forward slightly. "Bravery isn't about not being scared. It's about doing what's right even when you are." The girl smiled at that, the kind of smile that lives deep inside the heart. By afternoon, the police had finished their reports, the paramedics had come and gone, and the last of the curious onlookers drifted away. Only the sound of birds and engines remained. The world, it seemed, had returned to normal. But something had changed in that diner. Something invisible but lasting. Later that day, the owner, a gruff man named Joe who rarely said much, walked out carrying a box. He placed it on the counter and cleared his throat. "This is for her," he said, sliding it toward Carla. Inside were groceries, bandages, and a few small toys. It wasn't much, but it was what the people there could spare. Carla blinked back tears. I don't know how to thank you. Joe shrugged. Just get back on your feet. That's thanks enough. Hannah looked up at the bikers surrounding them. Are you going to go now? She asked, her voice soft as if the thought of their leaving hurt her. Mason took a deep breath. Yeah, kid. But we'll be around. She frowned. Promise? Promise? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver keychain shaped like a wing. It was old, a little tarnished, but polished enough to catch the light. He handed it to her. Keep that, he said. Whenever you see it, remember you've got friends on the road. Hannah clutched the keychain tightly in her hand. I will. When they finally rode away, the engines didn't sound like noise anymore. They sounded like guardians fading into the horizon. That night, the story was on everyone's lips. Locals told it at dinner tables, strangers repeated it in parking lots, and by dawn, the words had traveled beyond the town itself. Reporters tried to track down Mason's crew, but the bikers weren't interested in fame. They didn't return calls, didn't post online, didn't even tell their side of the story. They didn't need to. Because sometimes silence says more than headlines ever can. In the weeks that followed, small miracles began to happen around Carla and Hannah. A local church organized a fundraiser. A landlord offered them a small apartment in town. Neighbors dropped by with furniture, food, and clothes. And every Sunday, without fail, 3 motorcycles would roll quietly into the diner parking lot. Mason, Reaper, and Tank would sit at their usual table, black coffee, no sugar, and talk about anything but that day. Hannah would wave at them through the window, her red dress replaced by bright overalls, her face no longer streaked with tears but with chocolate from pancakes. Carla would smile at the sight, sometimes wiping her eyes when she thought no one noticed. To her, they weren't Hell's Angels anymore. They were something far more powerful, proof that even in a world full of cruelty, goodness could ride in uninvited, loud, and unstoppable. And though Mason never said it out loud, each time he saw that little girl smile, something in him healed too. A wound older than her years, something from a past he'd never spoken about, began to close. Because that morning hadn't just changed one family. It had changed him. And in some quiet, unspoken way, it had changed the town. Spring came slow that year. The frost melted one day and returned the next, as if the earth itself was reluctant to let go of its cold memories. But when the sun finally began to stay, the town started to bloom again, not just in flowers but in spirit. The diner, once a place for passing truckers and quiet breakfasts, had turned into something of a local landmark. People stopped by not only for coffee but to ask where it happened, the place where the girl in red had come running, the place where 3 men in leather jackets had changed everything. Carla had found her rhythm again. She worked part-time at the small grocery store across from the diner, and every afternoon she would stop by with Hannah. The little girl would sit by the same window where she had once waited in fear, but now her eyes were filled with light, her hands busy drawing pictures on napkins. Sometimes she drew suns and clouds, sometimes motorcycles, sometimes faces with kind eyes and leather jackets. Each one told the same story in a different way, a story she never stopped remembering, even though her tears had long dried. Mason still came every Sunday morning. He always sat at the same booth, back to the window, hands wrapped around his coffee mug. The waitress didn't ask for his order anymore. She just brought it with a knowing nod. Reaper and Tank usually joined him, their presence steady and familiar. They spoke little, laughed occasionally, but their silence carried peace, not distance. Hannah would run to them the moment she arrived, her shoes tapping fast against the tiled floor. "Uncle Mason," she'd shout, though he had never told her to call him that. He would turn, his stern expression softening. "Hey, little guardian angel," he'd say, just like always. She would climb onto the seat beside him, swinging her legs and chattering about school, about her teacher, about a stray cat she had started feeding behind the grocery store. Mason listened, every word carving new warmth into the quiet places of his soul. He had never been one for family. Life on the road didn't leave room for that. But in some strange, silent way, this child, this tiny burst of courage, had become something like his own redemption. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the windows and the smell of pancakes filled the air, Hannah came running in with a folded piece of paper clutched in her hand. "Uncle Mason, I made you something." He smiled. "Yeah. What's this?" She opened it carefully and laid it flat on the table. It was a drawing, messy but vivid, made with bright crayons. There were motorcycles lined in a row, a little girl in red at the center, and a tall man kneeling beside her. Behind them, a diner with a sign that read "Open" and a sun peeking out from behind clouds. "This is us," she said proudly. "When you saved my mama." Mason stared at the drawing for a long moment, longer than he realized. His throat felt tight, and his hands, the same hands that had seen war, fights, and broken lives, trembled slightly as he reached for it. "You keepin' this one or giving it away?" he asked quietly. "It's for you," Hannah said. "So you don't forget us." He folded the drawing gently as if it were made of glass, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his leather vest. "That's going with me wherever I ride," he said. Hannah grinned, her missing front tooth making the smile even brighter. Carla watched from the counter, her eyes moist. She caught Mason's gaze and nodded once, a silent thank you that carried the weight of everything she couldn't say aloud. That day, as the bikers left, Hannah stood outside the diner waving both hands high. Mason revved the engine twice in farewell, the sound deep and steady like a heartbeat. The other riders followed, sunlight bouncing off chrome and steel. The wind carried dust across the lot as they disappeared down the road, three silhouettes riding toward the horizon, vanishing into the same unknown that had always called them. But this time it wasn't emptiness waiting for them. It was purpose. Weeks turned into months. The seasons rolled again and life, as it always does, moved on. But the story never died. People who had once looked at bikers with suspicion began to greet them with respect. New faces came to the diner just to see the place where a child's courage had met a stranger's compassion. The waitress framed one of Hannah's napkin drawings and hung it near the register. Below it, she placed a handwritten note. "Kindness doesn't wear a uniform." Every traveler who stopped to pay their bill saw it, and most left quieter than they arrived. As for Mason, he kept riding. State to state, road to road. But no matter where he went, the drawing stayed tucked inside his vest, folded carefully, edges worn smooth. On nights when the road stretched endless and the stars felt too far, he would stop, take it out, and look at it beneath the dim glow of his headlight. It reminded him of something simple and true, that the measure of a man isn't in the miles he's ridden or the scars he carries, but in the moments when he stops for someone else. Sometimes, when he passed through a new town, a child would wave at the sight of his bike, and he'd wave back without knowing why it mattered so much. But it always did. Back at the diner, life continued with gentle rhythm. The sun still rose golden over the road. The smell of coffee still drifted out the door. Hannah grew taller, her laughter louder, her drawings more colorful. And every now and then, when a distant roar of engines echoed down the highway, she would run to the window, her eyes lighting up with the same joy that had once been born from fear. Because deep down she knew, those men weren't gone. They were just out there somewhere, riding toward the next cry for help, toward the next chance to remind the world that compassion doesn't always come wrapped in white wings. Sometimes it rides on two wheels, beneath the emblem of hell, carrying the quiet soul of an unseen angel. And as long as there were roads to travel and hearts to heal, Mason Cole would keep riding, with a crayon drawing close to his chest and the echo of a child's voice forever guiding his way.